Okay, thank you, Arjun, for already telling me that the broadcast has started. Yeah, I'm not starting the lesson just yet. We are still a little early. Just checking here if this works for everybody. So if you can hear me and if you can see the stream already, please do confirm this in the chat. I'm following both chats, at least I'm trying to. It's a little hard, of course, with this many students, but I'm trying to follow both the Twitch and the YouTube chat. Although I only embed the Twitch chat here in the stream, as you can see. Okay, thank you, Liam and Zuri, Murti, everybody who's confirming that this is working. Yeah, and also thank you those who are telling the others to maybe try to refresh the site. I'm just waiting a little bit more here so that most of you can catch the stream. Maybe some have an ad to watch or have to refresh, but it seems that most are good, so that's good. Yeah, hi Happy Cuba, of course I remember you. Yeah, it's good to see some of our regular students here, but of course we have many new students this month as it is free, so welcome everybody. Okay, I guess we can start the lesson. So once again, welcome everybody to this lesson. This is the first lesson this month of the Prodigy program in the 1500 plus section. My name is Arne Jochens. I am a FIDE master from Germany. I'm called Skimato here in the chat as well as on chess.com. You can see some of my messages if you scroll up in the chats. Yeah, I'm director of content at Chess University and of course a regular instructor here in the Prodigy program. And today we have a 1-hour lesson on the topic of bishop versus knight imbalances in semi-closed positions. And the regular students know that we covered some material on bishop versus knight imbalances last month, so I'm obviously not going to be able to repeat everything of that, but you should still be able to follow this lesson well if you were not attending last month. Most of these things you may already know, and also I will recap some of the things we discussed last month here and there. And especially I would like to start off with this position, which is a little reminder of some of the most important properties of both the bishop and the knight that we already discussed last month. So you can already think about this. It's black to move, and my first question is how you would evaluate this position. Yeah, the lesson just started. This is the 1500 plus section, the first lesson this month, and it's going to be about 1 hour long. So welcome everybody. I'm trying to follow both chats and trying to answer the most important questions, but of course I can't promise to see every question nor to answer every question because we just have so many students this month. Okay, CSU Dynasty and Quiet Aggression say that black is winning in this position. Well, black has 2 extra pawns, so that's good. One of them is a protected passed pawn, which is usually very good. But this is a special position in a way, because as you know, in the endgame the usual way to convert an extra pawn or 2 into a win is to promote one of your passed pawns. But how is black going to promote one of those passed pawns here? Or in other words, how is black going to make progress from this position? You cannot just say black is winning because he has 2 extra pawns. You have to think about a way to actually make progress. I don't think white is better because, well, black does have the 2 extra pawns, but if we just look at the minor pieces, then I think you can see that the knight is much better than the bishop in this position. And there are several reasons for this. One of the reasons is that all of white's remaining pawns are fixed on dark squares. and this means the bishop can never attack them. So the bishop has no targets in this position. And this is always a bad thing for the bishop because, well, you always want your pieces to be as useful as possible. And if your bishop has nothing to attack, that's a bad thing. And the reverse is true for the knight, because the knight does have a target here on d5. As you can see, this is a weak pawn that needs protection from the black bishop. And also these other black pawns are all fixed on light squares. And this is usually bad for the bishop if the bishop is playing against the knight, because these pawns being on light squares, they get in the way of the bishop, and also they make the position somewhat closed. And a closed position is usually beneficial for the knight, because the bishop tends to be more affected by the closed nature of the position. The closed nature of the position reduces the bishop's freedom of movement, but the knight's freedom of movement is not so much restricted because it can jump across those pawns. So it is threatening, or not threatening, but it is putting pressure on d5 in this position, for example. So this is one of the basic things to know about bishop versus knight imbalances, of course. The more close the position, the more happy the knight is usually, as opposed to the bishop. So in this position, the knight has an excellent square. It blockades the passed pawn and still attacks something at the same time. And this is also very typical. The knight is often the ideal blockading piece because it can do both of these things at once, attacking the pawn and still being active at the same time. So if you just look at the minor pieces, the knight is clearly better than the bishop in this position, but still, black has 2 extra pawns. So in most positions, this would still mean black should be winning. But this position is an exception because it turns out black just has no way to make any progress here. Well, let's look at some tries. There have been some tries suggested in the chat. King h5, for example. Yeah, Zugzwang is also a good suggestion in principle. If you're playing with the bishop against the knight, you should always try to create Zugzwang situations, and we will discuss this in more detail in the next example. But here I don't think black has a way to create a Zugzwang situation. But we can try, of course. So if we play King h5, it's not Zugzwang because I think the knight can just make a waiting move. Knight g2. It still controls the passed pawn. If black plays e3, the knight can just capture that pawn. So I don't think that white has anything to worry about here. In principle, what black needs to try to do is he needs to find a way to activate his kings. So king h5 is logical, but the white king will stay on g3, and then from h5 you cannot get any further. So another try is to maybe sacrifice one of the pawns, play g4, just to open up the position a bit more, and maybe then use Zugzwang to activate your king. If the black king could find a way to get to f4 in the end, then black would probably be winning. But white can prevent this. Well, in fact, if white takes the pawn, then of course black is winning, because then black can just exchange those minor pieces. And as you know, in most endgames, in most king and pawn endgames, an extra pawn that is also a protected passed pawn is enough to win. And here this is certainly true. Here black will just easily win because he can push the white king back with the help of Zugzwang and promote this pawn in the end. But of course, white doesn't have to take on g4. So what does white do after g4? Zugzwang is a German word meaning compulsion to move. And in chess this refers to positions in which having the move is a disadvantage, because any move that you can make weakens your position in some way. Yes, King f4 is suggested here by Amond PS, among others. And this is a very good move, because in this way we prevent the black king from getting any further. It's not so much that white wants to play king e5 because he wants to keep the g-pawn under control as well. Remember, the knight has to control the e-pawn, so the white king has to control the g-pawn. But white just wants to prevent this move king g5. Of course, black can still try king h5, but this is not so useful because now again... Well, now white may even be able to play king e5 because he may have enough counterplay. But he can also just play knight g2, I think. Again, preventing the black king from getting any further, and just asking black what he's going to do to improve his position. And again, I don't really think black can make any progress. Well, there's still one try left that we should look at. He can try to sacrifice the e-pawn. And now white needs to be careful. How should he capture this pawn? And hi Black Spock, by the way. Black Spock is one of our long-time students in the Prodigy program. So it's good to see some familiar names here. Although some of you have different nicknames on Twitch. This is the first time we're using Twitch for the Prodigy program, by the way. We usually used Hitbox or Livestream, but with so many students this month we decided that Twitch would be a better option. Well, Kunal Chuk, sometimes you have to move the king. Like in this position, we will return to this one, but to briefly answer your question, in this position I think you have to move king f4, because otherwise you might still end up in a Zugzwang position. You want to restrict the black king as much as possible. So I think king f4 is a good move. And now after knight g2 we said black could try e3. Well, I think I have just answered my own question, because if we take with the king, then we again allow king g5. So this looks like some progress for black. Now he can get the king to f5, and then it begins to look like white will end up in a Zugzwang position. So it's much better to just take with the knight. Well, maybe this is not obvious, because this seems to allow king h4. This could be the only problem, right? Maybe it's obvious that we want to keep preventing king g5, but by playing knight takes e3 we allow king h4 instead. But it turns out this is not such a big problem once the e-pawn is gone, because now white can plan to sacrifice the knight for the g-pawn if he has enough counterplay here in the center with king e5, and I think he does. So this is still somewhat complicated, you would have to calculate, but I think white has enough counterplay. There's also another option here. Instead of knight g2, we can also play king e5 immediately, even here when black has not sacrificed the e-pawn. Because first of all the bishop has to move, it will want to keep defending d5. Of course white cannot take on d5, because again the pawn endgame would be winning for black, this time because the g-pawn would queen. So, well, maybe then we should just return to f4. Yeah, this could also be sufficient to draw, but I like knight g2 better. I think this is at least easier for white to play. In any case, the conclusion here is, I don't want to analyze this too long. The position is still somewhat complicated, but against good defense by white, I don't think black has any way to make progress. So the point is that the nature of the position is such that it is almost completely closed, or even completely closed if you view it through the eyes of the black king. The black king would like to get inside the white position, but it doesn't find a way. And because the position is this closed, black doesn't have a way to convert his 2 extra pawns. The knight is much better than the bishop, and this tends to be true in closed positions. The more closed the position is, the better it is for the knight. So what I want to do in the remaining lesson today, I want to look at semi-closed positions, because these then are the most interesting positions. When we have a bishop against a knight, when we have a closed position, we almost know for sure the knight is going to be better. When we have a very open position, the bishop is going to be better. So I want to look at those interesting cases where it's not obvious at all which piece is better. And I want to focus on one of the most famous endgames of all time, maybe. Some of you will have seen this game before, but that shouldn't be a problem, because I think this is one of those games where you can learn something every time you review it, even if you have seen it before, because it's very, very instructive. It's white to move in this position. Maybe someone who recognizes the position can tell us the names of the players. Yeah, Brian. Brian is close. This was from one of Bobby Fischer's candidates matches in 1971, but the other one, this is from his match against Mark Taimanov. So I guess all of you are familiar with Bobby Fischer as a chess player, but maybe Mark Taimanov is not as well known. Although he was also a very strong player. He died only recently, by the way. Obviously, having reached a candidate's final was a great achievement in itself. But in this final match of the candidates, not the final, sorry, this was the quarterfinals, I think. But reaching this was still a great achievement. But in this match, Taimanov lost very badly, losing 6 games and not even drawing one, let alone winning one, as did Bent Larsen later the same year. So this was part of Fischer's famous winning streak on his way to becoming world champion. Yeah, let's think about this position for a bit. Maybe I shouldn't rush saying too much about the position, but I may already have given away the result. But if you just look at the position itself with white to move, I think you will agree it's not at all obvious whether this position favors the bishop or the knight, because the position is semi-closed. And by this I mean we have 2 open files, so it is somewhat open, but on the other hand we have no passed pawns at all, so it's not that open, and also there is no obvious way at all for either side to create a passed pawn, because there are no doubled pawns, no pawn majorities or anything like that. So it's not at all obvious whether the closed or the open nature of the position prevails here, and whether it will be better for the knight or the bishop. So what you have to do to judge this, you have to think about potential plans. And in particular you should think about potential targets for the minor pieces, and the other pieces as well. So for both white and black, think about which pawns or even squares could be targets for your pieces. Jernix is also a regular student, by the way, says I'd limit the knight with h3. Yeah, this is a very good point. We should mention the pawn structure is not only somewhat symmetrical, because the pawns are on the same files for both white and black, but it is also still fluid, meaning there are no pawns blockading each other yet. So both sides can still choose the squares for their pawns to some extent. White can still choose to leave the pawn on c2, or to play c3, or to play c4, for example. And both sides will try to use those options to their benefit, in particular to the benefit of their minor piece. And when you play against the knight, what you want to do is you want to restrict the knight, as Jernix says. h3 is an option for white in this position, because it would restrict the knight by preventing knight g4. And if you can manage to play enough of those restricting moves so that the knight does not have any good squares available at all, then this will mean that your bishop is going to be superior to the knight. So this is often the key question in such a position. Is the knight going to find a good outpost square? An outpost square is a square where the knight can be favorably placed and supported by one of his own pawns, but not attacked by any white pawn. So for example, in this position, c4 would be a horrible move to play, because this would give the knight a potential outpost square here on d4. Of course, black would still have to figure out a way to get there, but this would always be something for white to worry about. If black manages to get the knight to d4, then the knight would be clearly superior to the bishop. So this is something white has to try to avoid. He needs to keep his pawns flexible to put them on those squares that will restrict the black knight at the right time. But what is black going to try to do? Black cannot really hope to restrict the bishop very much, because the bishop has one very open diagonal, the long diagonal, available here. But on the other hand, there's nothing to attack along that diagonal. So even if the position is open in that sense, that the bishop has some very long open diagonals, if there's nothing to attack, the bishop could still prove to be useless. Yeah, there's still some discussion about this move h3 in the chat. It's true that h3 may not be liked by the white bishop that much, but I don't think that would be a problem. Although it's nice to keep the option to maybe play bishop h3 for some time. So white doesn't start in this position by playing h3, but h3 is a move that is going to be played later in the game, and it can be a useful move to restrict the knight. But of course you have to weigh the pros and cons. The con in this case would be you no longer have this square available for the bishop. And at the moment Fischer was thinking he would like to keep the option, or in any case he doesn't need to play h3, because knight g4 is not a threat yet. If black plays knight g4 in this position, we could still retreat the rook, say to e2, so that the knight is dominated by the rook. And then the knight can't go anywhere further, and we would still be able to play h3 later on, evicting the knight from g4. So g4, it's good to have h3 as an option, but we don't need to play it right away. Bishop f3 is also an idea suggested by Matt Chess. This is a typical theme in such bishop versus knight duels, trying to dominate the knight by the bishop. If you put the bishop on f3, you're controlling all of those squares that the knight might want to go to. But again, here this is not yet necessary, because knight g4 is not a threat anyway, and the other squares are already controlled by the rook. So bishop f3 is also a nice option to have, but not necessary to play right away. Yeah, Amond PS has a very good suggestion, and this is indeed the move played in the game. Bishop f1 is a very strong move, and a very deep move at that. The main point will only be revealed in the game some 30 moves later, I think. Bishop f1 does of course attack the pawn on a6, so black has to react to that, and he cannot play b5, because then the pawn on c5 would be hanging. So bishop f1 forces black to play a5. Also, of course, he can, well, maybe not of course, so I should mention this. He cannot defend with the rook, because then the bishop would find another target on f7. And now black cannot defend both a6 and f7 at once. So the move bishop f1 cleanly forces a5. But still, I think it's not obvious why this is an achievement for white. Isn't it good for black to place those pawns on dark squares so that the bishop cannot attack them anymore? Now black only has one pawn left that can be attacked by the bishop, and maybe black is just planning to move the knight and play f6 at some point, and then black might argue that the bishop has nothing to attack and the best white can achieve is just a draw from the position. Can you see what the flaw in this reasoning would be? Or in other words, why has white played this move bishop f1? Why did he want to provoke a5? Some suggest the reason is bishop b5, but bishop b5 is not a big deal. It's just a check, but I don't see any follow-up. So it may be nice to have this square, but I don't really see the significance. Well, that's only partly true. It's about the b5 square, but bishop b5 is not the reason white wanted to weaken the b5 square. The real reason is something else. Yeah, Chess Lover has a good point. In general, you weaken the light squares. So black has all of these pawns on dark squares, and this means the light squares have been weakened. These squares are not controlled by black pawns. But how can white exploit those squares? He can play a4. This is a good move that is indeed played in the game, albeit a bit later. So he can play a4 to fix the pawn structure on the queen side as it is. But still, the question is, why does white want the structure like this? Yeah, Arkais Lecht has the answer. The answer is white is envisioning a king march. He wants to put his king on b5 in the end. And this is a key concept in the endgame. You always have to think about all your pieces. It's good to have a bishop against the knight. Well, not always, but it's good to try to make your bishop superior to the knight. But in itself, this is not going to be enough to win the game. Just as in the previous position, to win the game, you need to activate the king. So in the end, you will have to find a way for your king to attack something. And now white has found something for the king to attack, because the king is going to attack the b6 pawn. And this can be very important. And this is only possible because white has forced this move a5. Yeah, this is a very long-term plan, as Bergou says, but white can afford to think long-term here because the pawn structure is not going to change very much. As you mentioned, white can play a4, completely fixing the structure. So when the pawn structure is not going to change, then you can make such long-term plans. Okay, so let's see how to execute this plan. I guess you could start with a4, but it's not necessary yet, because for the moment the bishop is controlling these squares, so the pawns cannot advance anyway. So white starts with bishop c4, targeting this pawn and activating the bishop a bit more. So black plays rook f8. And now white starts to activate the king, but he does not need to hurry. He can do this slowly, and he needs to be very careful not to allow black to find a good square for the knight. So he starts with king g2, so that, for example, if knight g4, the h-pawn is still protected, so white would have time to move the rook and then play h3, as we already discussed. Black plays king d6, king f3. Now if knight, well, now the king itself prevents knight g4 for some time. So black plays knight to d7, forcing the rook to go back. The rook goes to e3. Here it is very flexible because it may want to give a check, but also it has the option to attack this pawn on b6, which we already identified as a target. Although of course with the knight on d7 this may still not be very much for black to worry about. But it's nice to have this rook in such a flexible position. Black plays knight b8. Okay, so he may have the idea to bring the knight to d4, but here the white pawn is still on c2. So white can always prevent this knight d4 move by playing c3, if necessary. First he gives a check to see where the black king goes. The king should stay on the queen side because it may need to defend the b6 pawn. And now white plays c3. So he gives up the option to play rook b3, but he makes sure the black knight is never going to appear on d4. So this is part of this restriction policy that we mentioned. If you play with the bishop against the knight in a semi-closed position, you have to make sure, or at least do the best you can to try to prevent the knight from reaching any good outpost squares. Let me try to catch up with the chat a little bit. Yeah, but I think there are no questions to me as far as I can see. Yeah, there are some good comments about the position. This is all true as far as I can see. Okay, here's the question. Why can't the rook go to d5? Well, he could have at some point, but, well, I think it would lead to a pretty similar position. The black king would retreat probably to c7. So we would essentially have the same situation as now with the white rook on the d file. Black still plays knight c6. Why not rook e8? Well, rook e8 would not really prevent the white king from going to b5 in the end, because white can still play rook e3. And then, if the rooks get traded or not, the white king can still find a way towards the queen side. Either behind his rook, and then if black tries to put his rook on the d file, white can again play rook d3, and then king d2, and so on. So white wouldn't mind exchanging rooks. Of course, there is another immediate problem with this plan. Black would first have to play f6 to make sure he doesn't lose the f7 pawn. But also there is this permanent problem with this idea that white wouldn't mind exchanging rooks, as we are going to see. Indeed, white plays rook e3 even voluntarily in this position. Well, black goes back to d6. And now white does decide to play a4 to fix the queen side, even when the white bishop decides to leave this diagonal. Yeah, Ishan, this is essentially what's going to happen in the game. We are going to see the exchange of rooks. So this will be... the game will answer your question, I think. But first there were some other moves played. Knight e7, h3, knight c6, h4. You see, white does have this idea to bring the king to b5, but in itself this is not going to win the game, because even if the white king gets to b5, the black king can still defend the b6 pawn. And this is another typical thing in many endgames. To create a winning position, you often need to play against two weaknesses. So you need to identify two targets in your opponent's position. So we have already identified the pawn on b6 as a target. But what white needs in addition to this is another target on the king side. Because the more apart the two targets are, the harder it will be for black to defend them simultaneously. Well, you may say f7 is a target, but black can always play f6. So what white is looking for is he's looking to fix the king side pawns in such a way that at least one of them is going to be a target. So white has just played h4, and his idea is he wants to play h5 and follow up with g4, then maybe put the king on h4 and finally play this move g5 to attack the king side pawns. Yeah, g7, well, g7 is not so easy to attack at the moment. So white would need to change the pawn structure in some way to create a clear target. And he's trying to do this by advancing these pawns, the h and g pawns. And then he may be able to fix h6 as a target by exchanging on h6. Or maybe black is going to exchange on g5, and then g7 could indeed turn out to be the target. Or if black exchanges on g5, white would also have the option to create a passed pawn on the h file by pushing his h pawn to h6 later. So this could also be a weakness in a general sense. If you have a passed pawn, this can often be a weakness in your opponent's position because your opponent will have to defend against that passed pawn. Black would also have a passed pawn, but the h pawn is probably more significant than the f pawn, in particular since white has the bishop against the knight. And if you have the bishop against the knight, it's often good if there are many passed pawns. If both sides have passed pawns, the bishop is often good at supporting your own passed pawns while controlling your opponent's passed pawns, whereas the knight is not very good at this. Why does he choose the g and h pawns? Well, because there is no better way, I think. Do you have another idea how you would try to fix the kingside or to change the kingside pawn structure in a favorable way for white? I don't really see any other way. Yeah, if the minor pieces were exchanged, then the position would be pretty drawish. Not a dead draw, you could still play on, but it would be pretty equal. But trading rooks is going to favor white, yes, as we are about to see. So in fact, Taimanov respected this plan so much that he made a radical decision here. He wanted to prevent this plan with h5 and g5 in the end. He didn't want to end up with a weakness on h6 or g7, so he played h5 himself. But this is of course a serious concession, because now either this pawn itself, or if black defends it with g6, at least one of the black kingside pawns is now always going to end up as a target for the white bishop to keep attacking. In fact, white can attack this with the rook. As he does, he plays rook d3 check, king c7, rook d5. So having played h5, black is already committed to letting the other kingside pawns be fixed on light squares as well. He plays f5 and follows up with g6. Let's see this, rook d2, rook f6, some rook moves are played, but in the end black has to play g6 so that at least he only has one pawn to defend. He has to keep defending g6, he has to keep defending against this bishop f7 takes g6 idea from now on. But he was obviously thinking that this should still be okay, because either the knight or the rook can always defend g6. So black is thinking even after an exchange of rooks he could still play knight e7 defending g6, and the king can still defend b6. So he must have thought there was no way for white to make progress then. There was some discussion about other kingside moves here. Well, g4 I don't think is very promising for white. I guess you mean after h5. If you play g4, I think this change in the pawn structure would favor black now, because now the white pawns get isolated and black can still play f6. And if you try to use your king to attack the g7 pawn, well, you have to worry about the knight, but also your own h-pawn is also going to be a target for black's counterplay. Black can play rook h8, targeting your h-pawn, and even the f-pawn may be a target for black. So I think isolating your pawns like this gives black enough counterplay. Yeah, this may look very drawish still, so don't worry if you still think this position is very drawish, because Taimanov, who as I mentioned was a very strong grandmaster, must have thought so himself. But Fischer proves that this is not true. So now he executes this plan that we mentioned. Now he has two targets. He has the target on g6 and he has the target on b6. And an exchange of rooks is going to highlight the difference between the minor pieces. So maybe black should have tried to avoid the exchange of rooks. White plays bishop b5, rook d6, king e2, and now black allows the exchange with king d8. So he must have been really sure that this was still a draw. But in hindsight he should have avoided the rook exchange. So he could have played king c7 here, so that his rook does not get pinned and he can always avoid the exchange. White would still be better, but maybe not winning. But in the game king d8 was played, and now white does force the exchange of rooks. King c7, takes. So now white executes this plan. The bishop can attack g6, the king can attack b6. But still, why is this winning? The knight can defend g6 and the king can defend b6. And the answer, as you may have guessed, is once again Zugzwang. As I mentioned, if you play with the bishop against the knight, you always should try to create a Zugzwang situation. And here this can conceivably happen, because when the knight defends g6 and the bishop attacks g6, the knight cannot move anymore. So white just needs to find a way to create a position where the black king also cannot move anymore. So if you're watching this on video later, you can pause here and think about this on your own. Try to envision a Zugzwang position that you can reach by force as white. But this would be a very difficult exercise, so I'm not going to ask you to do this here in the live lesson. I'm just going to show you what happened. White played king d3, knight e7, bishop e8, so the first step of the plan is completed. The bishop attacks g6, forcing the black knight to stay on e7. Now black does of course try to prevent the white king from going too far, but here you can see how flexible the bishop is. He can check the black king and still keep attacking the g6 pawn. So white can get to c4 and also to b5 because of the same idea. He just checks the black king to make room for his own king. So the second step has been completed. The king is attacking b6. Now the black king has to keep defending b6. But where is the Zugzwang? Yeah, Kalekine has a question. I'm not saying this was a mistake by black to play h5. I think some commentators said h5 was a mistake, but I think the plan mentioned with white playing h5 was also very dangerous for black. So it was already a choice between two evils for black. I don't really have a good recommendation. I think this endgame was already very promising for white from the start, from the position we started with. Yeah, but an improvement would have been to avoid the trade of rooks as mentioned, and as KCupid11 says. Yeah, where is the Zugzwang now? Black is not yet in Zugzwang because he can still move the king a bit. So how exactly do we create a Zugzwang? Also, it's black to move here, but he still has... Yeah, you may think this is already Zugzwang because you may not want to go to a7, and if you go to c7, then white can play king a6. But black plays a cute move here. He plays knight c8. Maybe this is black's most active move in this entire endgame, because he's threatening a little checkmate here. This is also important to remember, of course. If you activate your own king, you have to be careful not to get checkmated like this. So first white drives the king away from b7, so that his own king will always have access to either a6 or c6. No checkmate. Now he plays bishop d5. Well, the knight just goes back to e7, bishop f7, and the king just goes back to b7. So this time it's white to move. And now I think you can envision the Zugzwang position. Yeah, it's very easy to overlook such a checkmate. I think Nigel Short just fell for a very basic checkmate like this in a tournament game. So even the best players can sometimes just completely forget that their own king may also be in danger. But I think Fischer never missed things like this. If the bishop had captured on g6, then knight d6 would have been checkmate. Couldn't black's knight make it to e4? Okay, let's take a look. Let's take a look. I guess you mean somewhere around here. Maybe after bishop d5. What happens if black plays knight d6 check here? Well, white's move is forced, and now black could try knight e4, attacking g3. But of course white can also take g6 at the same time. So let's check this. And now you can see another Zugzwang position that did not happen in the game, but I think this is something that Fischer has calculated. Now the knight itself cannot move anymore, because the bishop is attacking both of these pawns. And if you trade one of these pawns for one of white's pawns, again, we would get a situation where the bishop is clearly superior to the knight. If each side has a passed pawn, this is almost always going to favor the bishop. But if you have to move the king, well, you will run out of moves. For example, king c6, king a7. Well, maybe not. You can still keep the opposition like this. But white can make a waiting move with the pawn, like c4. And now I think black is in Zugzwang. You cannot keep moving the king, because the white king can go to b8. And if you move the king again, the white king is going to win b6. But if you move the knight, the best you can do is exchange either the f-pawn or the h-pawn for the other pawn that white has, but this would favor the bishop. And I think white would take this one so that he gets the outside passed pawn. And now he can even put the bishop here with check, and you can see the h-pawn is much stronger than the f-pawn in this position. And white is still going to win the b6 pawn, by the way, because now the black king has to move, and he also wins b6. So this is an example of where the semi-closed position has turned into an open position, where the bishop is now superior to the knight. I don't think this is unrealistic. I think this is a very common type of position, where there are initially no obvious weaknesses, but you can use your minor piece to induce weaknesses in the opponent's position like this. Of course, it's a rare game in that Fischer played this game extremely precisely. So that's what makes it so instructive. In most games between weaker players, White may have a promising position like this, but is not going to have the technique to convert it. But here this technique is displayed, and you can learn from this. I think it's not really hard to understand once you study this. And then you should be able to do the same in your own games. So, returning to this position after knight e7, bishop f7, king b7, bishop b3. Let me just show you how White creates the Zugzwang position. He plays bishop b3, essentially a waiting move. Well, not only that, he also wants to put the bishop on the long diagonal first of all, to reduce the options that the black king has, because now the black king has to make a decision. And he doesn't want to go to a7, because if he goes to a7, then it's Zugzwang immediately. If he goes to a7, White just makes any waiting move, and well, I don't know which one, let's just say bishop g2. And now the king can't move anymore. But if the knight moves, then I think we're ready to return to f7 with the bishop. So this would actually lead to a similar position as in the game. So just let me show you the game. Black played king c7 instead. And now White can play king a6. Now the knight has to move. Bishop d5. Knight e7. Now, if White plays bishop f7, then Black can still play king c6. So he loses a tempo with bishop c4, knight c6, and only now bishop f7. King e7. And now it's almost Zugzwang after bishop e8. So this is the position White wanted to achieve. He has run the black king almost out of moves, and also the black knight is out of moves. By the way to think about these positions, earlier in the game when we already had this pawn structure, White was probably not thinking about variations first of all, but he first thought about where he would like to have his bishop to achieve such a Zugzwang position. And only then do you look for variations to achieve this position. Yeah, if you know the game as Brian does, you know that White is going to sacrifice the bishop now. Because the Zugzwang is not yet complete, Black can still try king d8. And it seems that White has no time to win the b6 pawn, because his bishop is attacked. Yes, a prime ph. This reverse thinking is very useful in many endgames that are about key Zugzwang positions. And bishop versus knight endgames, if the bishop proves to be superior, are often about key Zugzwang positions. Yes, now White sacrifices the bishop on g6. Of course, this had to be calculated very carefully, but it does work quite well. He wins 3 pawns for the bishop immediately, and is able to create 2 connected passed pawns on the queen side very quickly. King d7, king takes c5, and now b4. But still, this needed careful calculation, because it's not so obvious that Black cannot stop those pawns. But it turns out this is the case. There's no way to stop the pawns. And also, if Black were to try to go for counterplay, well, it just takes too long. The knight just takes too long to attack g3 in this position. Taimanov didn't resign just yet. I think these moves were still played. Knight to c8, a5, knight d6, b5, knight e4 check. So he does finally attack g3, but he's not in time, because now white is already threatening king b7. So black has no time to take on g3 just yet. Has to play king c8 first. And now white just puts the king on c6. This is another key endgame pattern when you're fighting against the knight with your king. This setup where the knight and the king are on the same diagonal, separated by one square, is often a very good one, because now the king is dominating the knight. The knight cannot come closer to the white passed pawns because the white king is controlling these squares. And even if the knight goes to f6 or c3 to try to come closer, it's still dominated by the white king in a similar way. So that's why this position is hopeless. King b8 was still played, but after b6 now Taimanov did resign, because the knight can still not come closer to these pawns and the king alone obviously cannot stop them. Yeah, reverse thinking, Janix, was a comment about what I mentioned about the Zugzwang positions. So in such endgames that are about certain key positions with Zugzwang, like here, after bishop e8 we have such a key position. In this position black is in Zugzwang. The only move not to just lose one of those pawns here is king d8, but this fails to the bishop sacrifice, as we have seen. So already earlier in the game, say at this point, when we have the same pawn structure already, what white should do is not calculate variations first of all, but think about Zugzwang positions. Think about where you want your pieces to be to create a Zugzwang position. And once you have identified such key Zugzwang position, then you can look at variations to try to find a way to reach those positions with the right side to move, obviously. This is what I meant, or what a commenter, a student here in the chat, meant by reverse thinking. Happy Cuba asks, what if black went knight f6? Let's check, where could he have played knight f6? Well, maybe somewhere around here. Maybe after bishop d1. But well, if the knight moves at this point, then white is just going to play king c6, and the white king is too powerful. So he had to play king b7 first. And yeah, maybe here he could have tried knight f6, but I think then it's similar to that line I showed where black does get the g3 pawn, but white gets the g6 pawn. So you could play knight g8, bishop d5, knight f6, bishop f7, but you can see we essentially reach the same position we already discussed, where white can also establish a Zugzwang because white still has waiting moves with the pawns available. Sorry, you meant in the end here, after the bishop sacrifice. Well, after the sacrifice, I don't really know where you want to go to f6. Maybe around here? Well, you can try, let's take a look. But again, I think this is similar to the game, because white is going to advance the passed pawns, obviously. Let's say he starts with a5 as in the game, knight f6, and now a6 already forces the black king to move. Well, you can give the check first, but this would more or less transpose to the game, right? I don't think you have saved any time over the game here. Let me check this. Well, in the game white played b5 instead of a6, so let me just do the same to make the point that this would directly transpose into the game. Now we would have transposed into the game. So it doesn't make a difference in which way you go to e4 with the knight. It takes the same number of moves. Okay, so yeah, I think this is a good point to wrap up the lesson. So, well, we only covered this example in detail where the bishop was superior to the knight, but I think we still mentioned all the important aspects about playing such positions. So what you want to do in a semi-closed position where you have a bishop versus knight imbalance is, of course, you want to transform the pawn structure in such a way that is favorable to your minor piece. So if you're playing with the bishop against the knight, you want to make sure the knight doesn't reach a good outpost, so you may need to play little pawn moves to restrict the knight. And if you have an opportunity to change the pawn structure to something more dynamic, for example, to exchange one of your pawns indirectly for one of your opponent's pawns so that both sides have passed pawns, this is often going to favor the bishop. On the other hand, if you have the knight, you often want to keep the position closed. If you have a choice between opening and closing, usually with the knight it's better to keep the position closed. And of course you want to reach such an outpost square. So in a way the knight has achieved what he wanted finally in this position, but unlucky for him, it was just too late because white has these two queenside pawns already. But in principle this is what you want to do if you have the knight. You want to keep the position closed and look to create a good outpost square. And also note this thinking technique that Fischer applied in this game. Already in the position we started with, he was thinking about targets. So this move, this is no coincidence. I started with this position because I wanted to emphasize this first move here, bishop f1. This is really one of the key moves in the game, because by forcing black to play a5, white made sure that b6 would always remain a target for his king to attack. And this was only realized much later in the game, but black really struggled to prevent it. Maybe black could have defended better by not allowing an exchange of rooks, but he was in a very bad situation at this point already, as we can say with hindsight. And of course there's a general point to be made here. I think it can be very beneficial for you, for any chess player in fact, and also very enjoyable to study these great games of the past. Fischer has played many great games and a lot of other great players as well, of course, and there are a lot of great books with their best games, like Fischer's My 60 Memorable Games is a great book where Fischer annotates his own games. Also Taimanov, by the way, has published a book of his best games that is also very good. So this is a great way to learn these thinking techniques and these technical details, these ways to play certain technical endgames like this one. And also very enjoyable. Okay, so yeah, that's all from me for today. Let me check the schedule to answer your questions about this schedule. So in the 1500 section you have another lesson tomorrow. That is going to start at 10:30 a.m. Pacific time. So that's 1.5 hours earlier than this lesson started. And that is going to be with international master Kostya Kawutsky, and he's talking about how to punish slow plans. So I hope you'll enjoy that lesson. And yeah, next weekend you have lessons with Dalton and Kairov scheduled, and I'm going to teach in your section again in 2 weeks. Are there any questions that I missed maybe, or that you still have? I don't see any. Yeah, I'm not sure I was really able to follow everything you typed, but I tried my best. I hope you got most of your questions answered. So thank you everybody for your attention, and see you again in 2 weeks. Bye.